Hi there, and welcome to the Surviving and Thriving in Residency podcast. I'm Charley Lowry, your host and Director of GME Relations at PracticeLink. This show is all about exploring the world of graduate and undergraduate medical education. We'll dive into the real-life experiences, successes, and challenges faced by medical students, residents, and fellows, while also highlighting valuable tools to support you, whether that's financial planning, student aid, or the many free resources provided by PracticeLink. If you're thinking about med school, currently studying, or deep into residency or fellowship, this podcast is here to offer insights and support to make your journey a bit easier than those before you. Welcome to another episode of Surviving and Thriving in Residency. I'm your host, Charley Lowry, and today we have with us a very special guest, Dan Collard. Dan is a seasoned healthcare executive with more than 32 years of healthcare industry experience, including operations, consulting, and technology startups. He is the co-founder of Healthcare Plus Solutions Group, along with longtime colleague Quint Studer. Dan has served on the executive teams of organizations like Team Health and Press Ganey. He served as CEO of EVOQ Medical Incorporated, a healthcare technology startup, and of course was well known for his role at Studer Group for more than 13 years. It was Dan's role as a healthcare operator that framed the balance of his time in healthcare. He was recruited in 1999 by HCA to be part of the spinoff organization today known as LifePoint Health. Dan has always enjoyed the role of change agent within each organization he has led. In healthcare operations, Dan and his leadership teams help their organizations attain best-in-class performance across a balanced set of metrics: quality, patient experience, physician and employee engagement, volume growth, and financial performance. Dan is the co-author, along with Quint Studer, of Rewiring Excellence, Hardwire to Rewired, as well as Rewriting Leadership in Post-Acute Healthcare. His new book, Genfluence: How to Lead a Multi-Generational Workforce, co-authored with Dr. Catherine Meese, is now available on Amazon. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me here.
Of course. Yeah, we truly do appreciate it. I know you have a lot going on. You're very busy, so we do appreciate your time. So we'll kick it off by maybe going back in time a little bit to when you first started your career in healthcare, and especially at LifePoint Health. What drew you to healthcare in the first place?
Well, you know, it's funny. When I knew we were going to ask that question, I often say, as I speak around the country, I'm probably an outlier in the industry because I sort of fell into healthcare. I came from way outside the industry. Matter of fact, just this last couple of weeks, February 15th, was my 32nd anniversary in healthcare. And I really did. I sort of stumbled into healthcare. And so when I talk about folks that traditionally are in healthcare, many of those folks talk about having a calling into healthcare, especially with physicians like we're going to be talking to today. And I always sort of, maybe it's a joke, maybe it's serious. My calling was just to stay. And I'm just so pleased that the healthcare industry folks have allowed me to stay for the last 32 years.
Well, now, early in your career, before all of the executive titles, what did the day-to-day actually look like?
I'm an operator at heart. I still look through the lens of an operator when I work with partners, when I work with folks finishing residency, folks finishing their master's in healthcare administration, because I really kind of keep myself rooted in operations. And so as the traditional operator, I had a lot of the departments that you think of as the operations departments, the ancillary and support services departments. And, you know, early on, as I was really a brand new learner myself, a new student of the industry, it felt like a lot of the early days were just getting by day to day. And I look back and I think, gosh, when was that point where I finally realized there was more than just getting by day to day? And that's sort of what has evolved into the work that we do today, helping folks do more than just get by day to day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of days go by, and I think you have the best intentions of not just getting by day to day, right? But then before you know it, a week's gone, a month's gone, and time flies by very quickly. Yeah. So what were some early mistakes or hard lessons that shaped you?
Sometimes when you fail to be the student, when you realize this is a real learning opportunity, as opposed to maybe I messed something up and, you know, I made a couple of excuses as to why I messed it up, or even worse, sometimes when you blame others. But over the course of my career, I always find that I've probably been a little bit more successful when I return to the role of the student and I put myself in that learning. I have a poster off to the side here in my home office, and it says, you either win or you learn. And I think a lot of folks in healthcare especially take that win-lose mentality, that win-lose approach. And, if I didn't win, I lost at something. If I didn't recruit that one physician, I lost that physician, so to speak. And really, especially, and that is a great example, when I first began recruiting physicians, it felt like that. If someone turned us down to come to our organization, we felt like, gosh darn it, we lost them. And what I really began to learn is we could learn so much about each of those interactions so that when the next candidate comes to our community, comes to our hospital, we learn from the last one. So you either win or you learn. I think that's probably been my greatest learning lesson that helped shape where I am today.
I love it. That's so true. You can learn as much from the bad as you can from the good, right? Mm-hmm. Everything's an opportunity to learn.
It is.
Yes. So was there a specific moment when you realized I want to be a change agent in healthcare?
I think so much of that came from the people that were my early mentors. Matter of fact, the gentleman that first hired me in healthcare is a gentleman named Jim Edmondson. And Jim and I worked together for 4 months at an organization. And then I learned he was leaving. And I was really bummed because we had really sort of become friends as well as colleagues there. And we spent the next 4 years talking about working together. And it was Jim that opened up a pretty big door for me to come to HCA as we were preparing to spin off 2 different companies at the time, Triad and LifePoint Health. And Jim introduced me to a gentleman named Quint Studer, who many listeners will know and recognize. And we had a chance to go down and meet Quint at his then job as the president of Baptist Healthcare in Pensacola, Florida. And he just seemed to have this formula about creating the very best place for employees to work, physicians to practice, and patients to receive care. And he used a term called fire starter, that person that would really take the flame from community to community, or in our case, from job to job. And that flame can be a motivational flame. It can be an encouraging flame. And he wore a little lapel pin that was the shape of a flame. And it was really there in late 1998 that I knew there was more than just the day-to-day stuff that we were talking about. And so we've used the term fire starter for a long time, and that really is what a lot of us that have entered into this part of the business have really tried to do, is to either be the initial spark or to carry the flame from one individual to another.
So let's talk a little bit about residents here. We have a large listening audience of medical students, residents, and fellows. Residents often feel like they have very little control over systems. When you were early in your career and not yet in leadership, how did you begin building influence without authority?
Yeah. And again, I'll go back to being a student. There's a book that's been around forever called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, written by Dr. Stephen Covey. And in the early part of the book, Dr. Covey talks about 2 circles, the circle of influence and the circle of concern. And, there's a lot of folks that try to end up living in the circle, and it's around the things that they really, truly can't impact, really, truly can't influence. And so you have to learn the difference between where you spend your time, the things that you can control or influence, and the things that try as hard as you might, you're just not going to. But oftentimes it seems like that's where the energy suck happens. If you get all your energy out of there. From a resident, as folks come out of residency and perhaps fellowship, as part of the training, you're sort of taught to be the captain of the ship. In today's medical school training, even though we talk an awful lot about collaboration, there is still a theme of autonomy and being in control, if you will, because you have people's lives in your hands. And I think it's a great opportunity for us to say, let's control what we can control. And if there's something that we can't control, we either say, hey, I'm not going to spend all my energy there, or I'm going to learn about it. Maybe there's an opportunity for me to learn about it and then thus provide an amount of influence later on. Just some quick thoughts for me there.
I think a good example is we've had a really harsh winter this season, and I hear so many people complaining and saying, when will the snow stop? But the reality is you can't change it. You can never change the weather. That's one thing you can't change for sure. And so you either have to embrace it, accept it, and just move on, right? You're not going to change it. Don't waste your energy trying.
There's an idea that I was fortunate. I had a friend that shared an article with me from the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, back in 2000 or 2001. And it was such a helpful article, not only for me as a hospital leader, the guy in the suit, if you will, but for the physicians that I've since shared it with as well. And what the article said is when you take a look at the relationship between medical staff and hospital leadership, often referred to as the guys in the suits there, physicians are really only looking for four things. And these four elements are how I've really distilled almost every physician conversation I've had for the last 25 years. The article in JAMA said physicians are fundamentally looking for quality, efficiency, input, and appreciation. And sometimes it's a combination of a couple of the four there. But oftentimes things can be emotional. Things can be sort of a knee-jerk reaction. And especially when you don't get what you're looking for, when you maybe you need a new piece of equipment, the short answer is no, et cetera. What I found as a hospital leader is that when a physician would come to me, and especially in some of those more, let's call them tough conversations, if I could sit back and think, is this a quality approach? Is this an efficiency approach? Is this an input approach? Or is this an appreciation approach? Maybe the conversation can go a little better. And I think that would be something I would plant the seed with your resident audience as well as they prepare to finish residency, either go through fellowship or get right out into the practice world. Always be thinking about when you have a conversation to your question about things that we can control or not control. Those four fundamental elements really cover it all in the world of physician practice. So one of the little nuggets they can take away from today's conversation.
Yeah, that's great. That's great advice. So let's talk about the Studer Group. You worked there for 13 years with Studer Group, working with organizations from rural hospitals to academic medical centers. What did you learn about why some systems succeed and others struggle?
I had the good fortune of being invited to join this wonderful organization, and we found it came down to a couple of essentials. Number one, could you put in place an objective accountability system? Because for some reason in healthcare, we tend to like to stay on the subjective side. And the fundamental question would be, can a leader not hit their objectives? Can a leader not hit their goals and still get a good annual evaluation? And sometimes we see leaders play favorites. Sometimes it's because they've got the right personality. But what we found fundamentally is unless we can really find a way to measure what we do in our industry, it would always be tough. Secondly, you take those goals, those objectives of the organization, and then you ask the question, how good a job do we do giving our leaders the skills and the tools and the knowledge to hit the goals? And maybe it happens in other industry sectors, but we've all seen the example of he or she was a really good nurse, and the next thing you know, they're a nurse manager. He or she was a really good tech, and the next thing you know, they're running the radiology department. He or she was a really good doc, and all of a sudden, they're the chief medical officer. And the gap between what we observe first and what we observe next often is how well did we prepare those folks for those roles? Because just because they were a good clinician, a good technician, it didn't always mean they would be good in their or great in their leadership role. So that was the second thing. Is if you look at what separated the organizations that we called partners that were wildly successful, and those organizations across the industry that continued to struggle, it was having the right accountability system, giving the leaders the skills and tools to do their job, and then letting that cascade across the organization. Those are just a couple of the fundamentals.
What do you see as the biggest disconnect between frontline clinicians and executive leadership?
You know, oftentimes it's just a matter of, and it sounds so cliche, it's the why. We're in an industry that's pretty good at the what. We're also pretty good at the how, but a lot of times we miss the why. And it's owned both ways. You know, a senior team's obligation is to make sure when we're going to do something, when we make a decision, and maybe it's an unpopular decision, the way we have to lead is with the why. Here's why we're making this decision. We know it's going to impact some folks. We know it's going to impact some part of the organization, but here's why we're making that decision. People in healthcare tend to be pretty rational. And when they can understand the why up front, they tend to give leaders a lot of grace. Now, ownership of knowledge and of communication goes both ways. If I ever felt like I was on the front line, so to speak, whether I'm a frontline hospital employee, whether I'm a frontline doc, and I don't feel like I know really what's going on, it's my job then to also raise my hand and say, hey, can I just stop and ask a question as to why this decision was made or what's going on? We can't always just expect everything to sort of trickle down by osmosis or by magic. Ownership of communication goes both ways. And when we can close the gap of the why, boy, I tell you, it's just like magic. We've been with organizations that have seen such amazing strides in the area of leader communication and communication overall. And it's kind of like throwing gas on a fire. You really get to cooking when that element really is in place. We coach an organization called TriHealth over in Cincinnati that sits in the top decile for employee engagement. And when you look at the real key driver there, it's not that they pay more. It's not that they have better benefits. It's the fact that when you look at the survey data, the survey tool, the employees are saying there that the leaders are communicating better than ever. And it's not more communication. You can only have so many hospital newsletters in an organization. It's really that they really lead with the why and do a good job cascading that information across the organization.
That's incredible. So residents are often deeply frustrated by inefficiencies, culture issues, burnout drivers. From your perspective, what do high-performing cultures get right?
There's an analogy that we make all the time. A lot of times residents and physicians that are out in the practice world post-residency, they're sort of like the airline industry. I fly too much. I'm in the air probably 40, 45 weeks a year. And it's one of those things that when you show up to the airport, you sort of just expect the plane to be there. You sort of expect the on-time departure time, et cetera. Physicians are no different. If I'm a surgeon, I show up to the OR expecting the case to start on time. If I'm a physician that sees my patients in the hospital, I expect things to be ready when I'm there. I'm hoping that the patient's not getting bathed the same time that I round, because I've been rounding at the same time every day for the last 25 years. And so can you just make sure the patient's in the room there? There's a lot of analogies there. And when things don't go well at the airport, we've all been at the airport and seen the one passenger that's just flaming out about the flight being late or delayed or whatever, at the poor desk agent that had absolutely nothing to do with the plane being late or delayed there. And emotions can really run high there. And I think we see the same thing when things don't happen like they should in healthcare because of the serious nature of our work. It can really be an impactor, and it can lead to the burnout topic that you talked about. Burnout is at its core a design flaw. And so to your question, that's one of the things we can make sure is that first and foremost, we know quality, efficiency, input, and appreciation, the four things that docs are looking for. That number two in efficiency is just like the airport example. And when we find out that things aren't working in an efficient manner, we've got a couple of decisions to make. Number one, can we fix the issue? Number two, if it's going to take a while, let's make sure we don't wait till it's fixed to communicate, because I've found that in my history with physicians love those updates. Even if it's not fixed today, can you just let me know that we're making progress? And then the final one is, if the answer's no, please don't wait to tell me no till I come back and ask you again. Come with me and help me understand why we're maybe not going to be able to fix this particular issue right now. But let me know why again. That why will garner such grace there. It's not always an answer that's welcomed, but when we think about inefficiencies in our industry, so many of those, when you look at organizations that have great cultures, no matter how you describe culture, inefficiencies are one of those things that they pay a lot of attention to. Because if we can reduce the number of speed bumps in the day, whether it's a physician or a nurse or a technician, folks just go home in such a much better way. And when we think about burnout, a lot of times we'll talk about work-life balance, which really is hard to get to. So we like to talk about work-life blend. There's a phrase that a lot of physicians use called pajama charting. And that's because things aren't as efficient as they need to be, and they can't get all their charting done at home. So they find themselves, they go home, they grab a bite to eat, and they're sitting in the recliner having to log on to whatever the EMR is and finish out their charting. And that can be a real drag for physicians there. So what can we do to help physicians not only bring their best self to the practice, but also how can we send their best self home to their family? Because their family deserves to have their best self.
Hello, I'm Georgia Scott from Practice Link, and I'm excited to introduce an upcoming podcast from the Practice Link Media Network, MD Bookshelf. My new weekly show will invite physicians and healthcare professionals to share the books that help them push through burnout, find clarity, or see their careers in a new way. Honest conversations, unexpected reads, and a little inspiration along the way. MD Bookshelf, launching soon.
So if you could teach one system-level lesson to every resident in the country, what would that be?
Even before you get out of residency, start to temper your expectations. And I don't mean lower your expectations, but temper your expectations by beginning to understand the other part of our industry that's not your clinical practice. Begin to understand healthcare finance. Begin to understand healthcare operations. You know, I have a lot of friends that are physicians that end up doing their MD, MBA. And afterwards, what they said is, my gosh, I just understand this so much better now. I understand the healthcare ecosystem so much better since I took the finance course as part of the MBA. And now when I see a decision that's made by the guys in the suits, I don't think they're just those money-grubbing administrative types. I understand there's actually some rationale behind these decisions. So when I say temper your expectations, it's not lowering it. It's a matter of saying, hey, what can I learn beyond medicine? See, because here's the reality. If I'm a resident today, I'm already a really smart person. I've already sort of proven myself. I made it through undergrad. I made it through medical school. I made it through match. I've got a lot up here. And what I'd say is find a little bit of capacity in the brain to understand the larger ecosystem of our industry.
So you've described yourself as someone who enjoys being a change agent. What does that actually mean in practical terms?
To some folks, it's always fun to play word association when you mention the concept of change or change management. It lights some folks up. It gets their juices flowing. Others, it gives them the hives because there are some folks that like their groove. There was a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson that said, people like to be settled, but there's only hope to the degree that we can unsettle them. And so in addition to being a change agent, we also kind of think of ourselves as professional unsettlers. Now, not unsettling folks to the degree that you create a lot of angst, a lot of anxiety, and sometimes paralysis. But part of being a change agent is always being able and willing to ask the question, what if, or why not? Being able to sort of challenge the status quo. I mentioned in the very beginning that I just fell into healthcare. And one of the things that I've always done with a lot of intentionality is to maintain that outsider view. My first couple of weeks in healthcare, I was at an organization that it felt like it was the day before a wedding. It was like controlled chaos at this hospital. And I didn't know what was going on. And finally, the new guy said, hey, what's going on? And they said, shh, Joint Commission's coming. I didn't even know what Joint Commission was. I mean, this is Northeast Oklahoma. We've got some issues in society. I thought maybe it was Joint Commission with some kind of marijuana regulation. I didn't even know what it was, but all I knew was it felt like the day before a wedding. Then we had our survey, and we did very well. And this is the old platform. We scored a 98. We got accreditation with commendation. We got no type 1 findings, which for those that aren't familiar with Joint Commission in those days, that meant it was a really good Joint Commission survey. And then I learned one of my first lessons the day after the survey. It was called the Big Exhale. Everybody was like, whew, glad that's over. And then, of course, the outside guy, the new guy, asked a question that said, well, wait a minute, I'm confused. If you all thought this was so important, why wouldn't we be acting like we were acting last week all the time instead of just every 3 years? And so that's another part of being a change agent is that change is typically the most successful when we see it as ongoing versus episodic. One of the things that I've learned can be a real demotivator in healthcare is to launch a change effort and get the results only to not sustain the results. So we get this big bump in whatever we're doing, and then it just fades away. That can be a real drag on an organization, be a real drag personally to think I put all this work into it and I didn't sustain it. So I think that's another practical term, is to always see change as chronic, if you will, versus episodic.
So funny. I used to work for a medical school, and my offices were in several different hospitals, and I could tell by the look on people's faces when Joint Commission was happening. I could say good morning and look at them and think, oh, okay, I know what's happening. You're so right. So how do you lead change when physicians are burned out, skeptical, or distrustful?
I'm going to land on distrustful, because I think oftentimes lack of trust is really the root of everything we're talking about. And so what can we do to, first of all, build trust? And so as you're leading change, you have to think of trust as a lot of that root there. Folks might not understand it, but if you can get them to just trust you that this is a good decision, this is a good route to go, that's key. I just published a new book, as you had referenced, called Genfluence. And there are a couple of pieces in there that remind me an awful lot of our physician relationships. I use a quote from President Abraham Lincoln. You know, if you're a historian and you study the Lincoln years, you'll know that Lincoln built a very unusual cabinet. He built a cabinet made up abundantly of people that weren't necessarily his friends. He had cabinet members that were from the other political party. He had folks that had opposed him in the legislature, and it made for a really interesting cabinet dynamic. But there was a quote that's often attributed to Abe, and the quote is, "I don't like that man. I must get to know him." And so that's one of those elements of tempering expectations. And then in the very final chapter of the book, Genfluence, as we think of this framework of managing and getting along with each other, you have to see every single interaction as an opportunity to build trust. And we know what the most common element of change in the last decade in our industry, especially relative to docs, is the introduction of a new electronic medical record. And so whether it's the Epics or the Cerners or any of those, oftentimes those decisions feel like they get made in a vacuum. They also feel like the vast amount of emphasis is on the technology. It's on the process. And oftentimes what we've forgotten is the people piece. So if I tie that back to a couple of questions that you've asked already today about, what's it look like when it's successful? If you take a look at some of the most, and I'll use Epic as an example because they've become sort of the prolific EHR out there. If you look at the most successful Epic go-live events in our industry by system, every single one of them had one thing in common, and that was the engagement level of the medical staff. Not their engagement level, but the ability of leadership to engage the medical staff so that we weren't waiting till go-live day to find out whether this thing was going to work or not. And so if there's one way that you prevent burnout, it's engagement early on. The electronic medical record environment was theoretically designed to reduce the number of clicks, improve workflow. But I've been on site on a couple of go-live days, and I've seen physicians that we almost reduce them to kindergarten status with a big, thick crayon and a big Chief Indian tablet. That's sort of the visual that I get there. And what I realize in those cases is we didn't do a really good job engaging them on the front end. So much of this, we talk about preventive healthcare as being the real direction we should go in our industry. I think we should take the preventive healthcare stance with our docs as well. Let's engage them early on versus have them be the recipient of a system that maybe isn't well designed and it just causes more angst than anything.
I can see that. So for residents who might feel overwhelmed right now, what's one habit or mindset shift that prepares someone to become an effective leader later?
I was just having a conversation this morning with an individual that has been thrust into a leadership role pretty suddenly. And she's been at it for about 8 or 9 weeks now, probably about 9 weeks now. And this morning she told me she was just exhausted. As a matter of fact, she wasn't just exhausted. She had just gotten a prescription for an antibiotic because she was sick. The exhaustion had really impacted her health there. And I asked her one favor this morning. I said, I need you to make me a promise. Promise me that this weekend, you're going to find some time to give yourself some grace, give yourself some space, and give yourself some grace away from the overwhelmedness, and realize all the good that you've done in the last 9 weeks. She took on a pretty significant environment. There was a lot of things that needed attended to, needed fixed, a lot of personalities in play, and it's been nonstop. You know, we used to joke when I was a hospital leader, we only worked half days, 7 to 7. And I think she's been working 3/4 the days there. But I think residents also fall prone to that. A resident works an incredibly busy schedule. They have the chief residents that they're taking their marching orders from. They have the attendings that they're taking their marching orders from. And this can all lead to a sense of overwhelmedness very easily. But the reality is, one of the greatest things you can do is just give yourself some grace. Find some space to think about, my gosh, I'm a third-year resident. I've made it. I'm in a 3-year program, particularly, but I've made it. Think about all the interactions that I've learned from. Think about what I've brought to the clinical table in terms of diagnoses, in terms of good, sound clinical opinions. It's not like I've been the one just taking the marching orders all the way through residency. So it sounds real easy, and it's probably harder than it sounds, but find a place to give yourself some space, give yourself some grace that sort of allows you to come back out of that overwhelmedness. And what we find is those are the folks that typically also find a path to leadership, because they realize, back to those circles of influence and circles of concern, there are things you're going to be able to control, there are things you're not. And those that figure out that formula tend to be the one that we find are the good leader candidates later in their career.
Hi there, my name is Olga Gross. I'm a recipient of the First Practice Fund Scholarship. We all know starting a career in medicine is not easy. For many of us, financial stress is just another part of the journey. That's why the First Practice Fund meant so much to me. It's not just a scholarship, but it is true support for those working to bring care where it's needed most. Applications for the next round of this no strings, free to enter scholarship are opening soon. Visit practicelink.com for more information.
So now, what's the difference between positional leadership and personal leadership?
Our industry tends to be full of a lot of positions: a chief fill-in-the-blank officer, an executive director of, a director of, a manager of, a department chair, a section chief in the medical school world there. Those are all positional leaderships. And oftentimes, positional leadership comes with a span of control. You've got a group of followers there. And sometimes I'll call that more of a functional leadership role as well. There are just some specific things I have to do functionally to lead others. One of the most important pieces in that role is to think of yourself as a chief development officer also. It's not just the organizational development officer's job or the HR officer's job, but part of my job as a positional leader or functional leader is to help those whom I lead become developed, especially in this new generation. 87% of millennials and Gen Zs in a recent research project said they would stay at the same job for the same wage if they felt grown and developed. The problem is only 23% of them said they worked for an organization that was growing and developing them. And I think that fits really well with new residents and new fellows coming out as well. Personal leadership. Personal leadership, I think, is really more of an illustrative position. It's sort of, how do I live the values? How do I illustrate the values? How do I make sure that I'm doing the right thing even though someone's not watching? That really, I think, is a nice way to sum up personal leadership there.
Let's talk about advice for residents. If you could give 3 pieces of advice to residents and fellows who want to shape the future of healthcare, what would they be?
Yeah. First of all, know that you've earned it. Know that by virtue of medical school, residency, and or fellowship coming out, you've sort of earned the ability to shape healthcare. This is pretty fresh on the brain since we just wrapped up the book, and we talked an awful lot about the differences, and sometimes that older generations have this stance that younger generations have to pay their dues or bust their knuckles. But what we found in the research is that organizations that open up opportunities for the younger generations to lead in some way, shape, or form. It could be a project, could be a team effort. When you can create a psychological safe environment in a multi-generational team and intentionally look to the younger generation to lead. And if you don't mind, I'll give a nursing example, but I want the residents that are listening to relate and not compare to the example. There's an organization that we work with that was struggling in one of their departments to just get the staff to attend regular staff meetings. And, there were all sorts of reasons and excuses why folks weren't showing up. They were down at around a third of their staff. So call it about a 33% participation rate in the staff meeting. And those were important meetings. We asked a while ago about how do we close the gap between senior leadership and frontline folks. And one of the ways we do it is having these regular staff meetings. Well, they couldn't figure it out. And the leader of that department, not only the manager, but the directors as well, they had a really high degree of trust in the younger nurses on the floor there. So they went to a couple of the charge nurses and said, could you help us figure this out? We just can't crack the code on getting folks in to attend the staff meeting. And these young charge nurses found that you can actually create a closed Facebook Live environment. And they created a whole new kind of staff meeting. It's called Chatting with Charges. And it's on Facebook Live. And they're running 93% participation rate at their staff meetings now. They'll have a nurse in the park with their kids playing. They'll have a nurse in the grocery store pushing the cart with their phone right there on the grocery cart. Now, they still have folks that show up for the staff meetings there. But imagine the difference in the culture of that department when you go from less than a third participation rate to almost all participating there. And so now if we take that down to residents and fellows, you've earned it. So I think it's an opportunity for us to shape healthcare by saying, hey, put your hand up every chance you get. The answer is not always going to be yes, but never hesitate to put your hand up. And I think one of the big differences there is that when you're in residency, by design, you are there to learn from your senior residents. You're there to learn from attendings. But once you get out in the practice world, you're sort of on par. You're sort of on par with folks. And it's really important that you're willing to raise the hand. I recruited a young ENT fresh out of residency a number of years ago. He was probably one of the brightest physicians I ever recruited. And what I loved about him is not only was he bright, he just had this spirit about him that he was coming out of residency with. We happened to be building a medical office building, a brand new MOB at the time. And the first thing he did when he showed up was he handed me a DVD. I found out that he was also pretty good at AutoCAD, and he had already designed his office. He knew exactly where he wanted the audiology booth. He knew exactly how he wanted the exam rooms. Now, imagine that. Contrast that with a resident that's being recruited today that just says, hey, just put me anywhere you need me to, or heaven help us think, I'm actually going to tell you how I'd like my office to look right there. This physician shaped healthcare in such a way that he was really sort of saying, hey, I want to be the master of my own destiny. Now, I always like to tell the end of the story. That was in 2002. That was 24 years ago. That physician is today in that same community, that same practice, and wildly successful. This was not one of those stories where you recruit somebody and they work off their guarantee and then they hop to another role right there. That physician is in the same community 24 years later. And here's what's really neat about that doc. I had a chance to go back and visit the town a number of years ago, and I thought I'm going to go by the hospital and say hi to some old friends. And I actually had a surgical nurse hear that I was in the hospital. She came and sought me out. And of course, my first guess is, oh gosh, what did I mess up 10 years ago when I was here? And her name was Teresa, and she came and found me and she said, I never had the chance to tell you thank you for recruiting Dr. Matt. He still to this day goes around and thanks every single person around the operating table at the end of a shift, at the end of a case, and at the end of a day. She said, you just have no idea how nice it's been to have him in this community all this time. So think about it. Residents and fellows wanting to shape the future, take control of your own destiny. You've earned it.
That's so incredible. How about leadership skills? What should they start building now during training?
I think this really comes back to that question of getting to understand healthcare holistically. Even though your pursuit was not necessarily an MBA, it was an MD or DO, you have to get to know the ecosystem of healthcare. And that ecosystem is not just finance. That ecosystem is people. One of the most important parts you're going to have to learn, we talked a while ago about personal leadership and positional leadership. If you're going to succeed in that personal leadership piece, you have to understand the people piece. What I always used to tell folks is, look, let's understand first and foremost, physicians are scientists. And as scientists, we're driven by good, credible data versus anecdote. Well, here's the neat part. There's a lot of good, credible data around what drives the people piece. Almost every organization out there in healthcare today does an annual or a semi-annual employee engagement survey. Wouldn't it be cool as a young resident to ask for that data the next time the next survey comes out, especially if you can think about the departments in which you practice there, to understand really what makes people tick? So that's one thing. The other thing is it's never too soon to start learning about, I'm a new resident, I'm a newly practicing physician today, fresh out of residency, fresh out of fellowship. But fast forward 5 years, and now I'm the veteran, and I'm having to work with these new rookies coming out of residency and fellowship. Think about everything you like about coming out of residency and fellowship. Think about what scares the bejesus out of you coming out of residency and fellowship, and sort of tuck that away for 3 years down the road when you then get to mentor the next generation of leaders. Because, physicians, we have this routine in medical school training, see one, do one, teach one. And I think that applies even better to the people component of healthcare as well.
Yes. Well, so as we kind of look at wrapping up, let me ask you, what do you believe healthcare will need most from this next generation of physicians?
I think first and foremost, we need what they went to school for. We will always need their clinical expertise. And then this might shock some people, this might depress some people, but I think we also need them to remain students. And that's going to sound tough because they've just finished 10 or 12 years of being a student, of being in school with their undergrad, their medical degree, internship, residency, and fellowship. I'll give you a great example. I have a dear friend who is a double boarded physician. He's boarded in both internal medicine and emergency medicine. And I don't think I know of another physician colleague that sort of illustrates that constancy of learning. And now he's sort of turning the constancy of learning into the constancy of doing. He came to me recently and said, hey, I've got an idea for a book. Would you take a look at my manuscript there? And what's really neat about the book is that it's designed to teach younger physicians about how to grow into leadership. But Dr. Michael Corvini, I will tell you, is sort of the epitome of the lifelong learner. And so even though you just finished up your years of learning, stay the student as much as you can as well. And, there's a lot of examples today. The two letters we hear more than anything today in healthcare, A and I, especially put right together. What are we going to do with AI? What role does AI play in the role of advanced practice clinicians that inevitably you're going to work with as a nurse practitioner, a PA, or a CRNA? As a physician, you're in all likelihood going to have interactions with them. And so if I can sort of keep myself in the student role, I think I'm set up for success. And I think the industry is set up for success.
I love it. I have a lot of physician friends who are looking toward more retirement, but they still always have medical students and residents working with them. And their theory is that's how I'm always learning. That's how they keep me on my toes, is what they tell me. Keep those students and residents with you, and you'll definitely be learning something that way, if no other way.
I couldn't agree more. I'm getting ready to head out to the American College of Healthcare Executives annual Congress. It's a gathering of about 7,000 healthcare leaders from across the nation. And even though there are some amazing sessions that I plan on going to, when people ask, what do you like most about going to Congress? It's always one specific answer. I seek out the opportunity to interact with young folks that are just finishing their master's in healthcare administration as either an MHA resident or an MHA fellow. I find that's the most fulfilling time that I spend at Congress. Matter of fact, I just had a breakfast invitation come my way for a young resident that's in Louisiana, that's part of the FMOL system there in Louisiana. And I just can't wait to get there and interact with those folks that are about to come out of their MHA program. And like the question you just asked about clinical residents and fellows, they're about to help shape the future of our industry.
So as we wrap up and close down, is there anything you want to share? Do you want to share any websites, any information that the residents and medical students and even healthcare listeners that they might benefit from?
I've had the good fortune of writing a couple articles for a physician-related website recently. And what I'll do, because I don't think I'd do it justice trying to quote the website, we'll provide the website as an accompaniment to this podcast. There's two articles specifically. One is about how do new physicians get to trust the suits. And so we talked a little bit about that in this podcast. And then the next one is the ability to lead in a multi-generational dynamic, a multi-generational environment, becoming a real core competency for physician leaders. And so I'll make those websites available to you, and you can share them as part of the dissemination of this podcast.
Absolutely, Dan. I cannot thank you enough. This has been just incredible value for our listeners. So for those out there in residency or fellowship, I think one of the biggest takeaways from today is you don't have to wait for a title to start building influence. You don't have to understand everything about healthcare operations to begin learning how systems work. And you certainly don't have to choose between being a great clinician and understanding the business of medicine. So, Dan, thank you again for joining us on Surviving and Thriving in Residency. Be sure to check out all of the great free resources on practicelink.com. If you're a medical student, resident, fellow, or APP, be sure to apply for our first practice fund, which will be open for applications until May for the spring scholarship. Those are $2,500 scholarships that we offer in the spring and the fall. And if you would like to be a guest on the Surviving and Thriving in Residency podcast or learn more about our GME outreach, please contact me via email at charles.lowry, that's Lowry, at practicelink.com. And to our listeners, if today's episode resonated with you, share it with a co-resident or program leader. The future of healthcare depends not just on surviving training, but on building leaders who can transform it. And until next time, we hope to see you again on Surviving and Thriving in Residency.